Good evening. Thanks for coming. For those of you who I've not yet met, my name is Melissa Giller. I have the honor of being the Chief Marketing Officer here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Before we get started, as we do for all of our events, I'd like to ask for you to please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And finally, before we start the program, I would like to recognize David Trulio, the President and CEO of the Reagan Foundation. So President Reagan, while speaking about the Bible at the 1983 National Prayer Breakfast said, "Can we resolve to teach, learn, and try to heed the greatest message ever written, God's Word and the Holy Bible? Inside its pages lie all the answers to all the problems that man has ever known." Now that quote still holds true today. And speaking of the Holy Bible, I think you all know, but just in case, just a few months ago, the Reagan Library did install and open its latest special exhibition, an exhibition that highlights and celebrates one of the most significant archaeological finds in modern history. It's an exhibition that offers a first-hand experience of the ancient manuscripts of the Israel Antiquities Authority and their profound implications for our understanding of the history, culture, and religious practices of ancient Judaism and the early foundation of Christianity. Of course, the exhibition I'm talking about is the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibition, and again, created by the Israel Antiquities Authority from the collections of their national treasures. Now, the actual scrolls that were found that we're going to talk about tonight, they make up the entirety of the Hebrew Bible with the exception of the book of Esther. And of course, the Hebrew Bible is the Old Testament, and we'll talk about that. And the exhibition marks the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit return to the United States in almost a decade. In fact, many of the scrolls that you will see within our exhibition either haven't left Israel or haven't been on tour in over 10 years. And in addition to the 8 scrolls that are always on display, there are over 200 other artifacts on display as well. Now, I'm going to be really honest with you. I always share with people that this exhibition's here at the Reagan Library, and they ooh and they ah, and they tell me they can't wait to see it. And they look at me with this confused look in their eye, and they say, "Well, why is that exhibition at the Reagan Library? I just don't understand it." So let's take a quick second to discuss. President Reagan was deeply shaped by his Christian faith, and he frequently engaged with both Jewish and Christian leaders while he was in the White House. In fact, if you didn't know, the Bible was actually one of his favorite books. He used to say that all the time. And when he took his oath of office both times as President of the United States, he placed his hands on his mother's Bible, the Bible that is on display in the Reagan Library, and both times it was opened up to the Old Testament chapter chronicles. To learn more about the exhibition and the scrolls themselves, we are joined today by Dr. Joe Uziel, the head of the Dead Sea Scrolls unit of the Israel Antiquities Authority. So Joe, you come on up. We're going to have you in that seat.
Okay.
We'll give him a second to remove the podium.
Okay.
So fancy here.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
You are a very busy man. For those of you who don't know, and we'll be talking about it later, but he's actually here because the 8 scrolls that we have on display are being swapped out, so he's here to help with that swap. But let's actually start at the very beginning. For those who don't know, what actually is the Israel Antiquities Authority?
So the Israel Antiquities Authority is the government body in charge of caring for the archaeological finds in Israel. And that means that if a road in Israel is being built, or if a structure is being built, and there is a chance that there are archaeological finds there, prior to the construction, the Israel Antiquities Authority will send out an inspector who will check the area. Then while the construction is going on, they will make sure that no artifacts are coming out. They will often need to stop the construction work and say, wait, we have something here. And then will excavate what we call salvage excavations, which means we're excavating prior to the development. We realize we can't stop the building of roads, we can't stop the construction of buildings, people can't live, outdoors or in huts anymore. And so basically, most of the excavations will be excavations where we work in the field, we document everything, we remove the artifacts, and then we release the land for development. The Israel Antiquities Authority was established because in 1977 the state of Israel passed the Antiquities Law, which said that I, as an individual, not as a worker of the Israel Antiquities Authority, cannot collect artifacts, cannot search for artifacts, cannot go into an archaeological site with a little pickaxe and start digging away and then take the finds home. The finds belong to the state of Israel. They are part of its cultural heritage, and therefore, if I even find a stray artifact, I need to pass it on to the Israel Antiquities Authority. This, by the way, actually happens quite a bit, and there are a lot of these great stories of people who are walking around archaeological sites in Israel, and they look down, and all of a sudden they see artifacts, and they pick them up, and then they bring it to us. And it could be, ancient coins, or seals, or small figurines, different types of finds. It's quite often young children who have better vision than I do, and they walk around, and they pick these things up, and then they bring it to us, and so this is what the Israel Antiquities Authority does.
And how often are artifacts found?
So Israel has a very, very, very rich history of settlement. Just about anywhere in the land, there are ancient sites. Those sites could be big cities like Jerusalem. They could be sites that are located out in far distant areas where you would say to yourself, why would anyone live here? Like Qumran, which I think we'll probably mention a little bit later. They could be small, farmsteads where a farmer lived 3,000 years ago, or even more, to, grow crops. Most often, it would be grapes or olives, because those are the big commodities that can bring in, a nice living. So basically, they're found all the time. The Israel Antiquities Authority, on a regular year, will have hundreds of excavations that are conducted. There are also several projects that are sort of nonstop, round the clock. So I mentioned Jerusalem before. We've been digging in Jerusalem basically nonstop now for, I would say, coming on 30 years.
And continually to find things.
And continuing to find things. I mean, I know that I worked in Jerusalem excavating before I came to the Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I worked in Jerusalem as an archaeologist for 10 years. And in fact, one of the cool focal points of this exhibition is we brought a group of finds from one of my excavations, so I'm connected to it very closely, but they had never been on display before anywhere. The Reagan is the first, and that's part of the finds that we found on the pilgrimage road, the road that would connect the gates of the city with the entrances to the temple 2,000 years ago. Okay, so during what we can call the late Second Temple period, the period where you mentioned before the foundation of early Christianity, some of the stories of the New Testament reflect on these, this pilgrimage in Jerusalem, and these finds are on display here. And so I worked there for 10 years, but I remember when I began excavating there, when they offered me to excavate, it was like, yes, for sure. And then it was like, what can we still possibly find?
Right.
They've been excavating here so much. So a couple of things that I can say to that now in retrospect is, A, there's always something new. There's always something surprising. There's always something you didn't expect to find that we come across. And the other thing, and this is also related to the exhibition, is we're doing better archaeology now than we were doing 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. And it's not because I'm a better archaeologist, okay? There were great archaeologists before. Maybe we'll mention some of them as we go. But it's because the tools at our disposal today are much, much, much more advanced. So we're using analytical tools, new sciences, digital tools, which are allowing us to learn new things about the world of archaeology, about these people who lived in the past and left their remains behind, like this glass of water, where, just to give a small example, this glass can hold water, but it can hold other things as well. Well, now in our science, and mostly we'll talk about pottery, not glass,
right.
but pottery is porous. And so the molecules of the liquid held in different vessels, like a glass or a cup, will go inside into the pores. And we can now extract those molecules and understand what was in the cups or the jars or the cooking pots. So we understand better what people were eating and trade going on. So can I go off on tangents?
I expected you to.
Okay. Okay.
I've known you now for a year.
So, for example, one of the research projects that we've been doing, we took a bunch of storage jars from the destruction of Jerusalem in the First Temple period, 586 BCE. 2,600 years ago, and we found them in a couple of different storage rooms in different parts of the site. And we said, okay, let's do this research. Let's extract the molecules. And I say it in a very funny way. Oh yeah, you extract the molecules. It's much, much, much more complex. There are big machines, mass spectrometers and whatever. But yes, at the end of the day, we're able to tell what was in these jars. And so we came up with some things that were totally not surprising. So you're in Israel, and I mentioned before the growing of grapes and the growing of olives. So you have
wine and olive oil.
And wine. But now here's where it gets interesting, because some of the wine was actually not just plain wine. We're not talking about 2024 where you can get a 1998 Cabernet Sauvignon grown in France. You're talking about wine that was probably not at the same quality that we're used to today. And in order to make it of better quality, it was often spiced. And we know this from textual records in different periods. And here what we found was that the wine was actually spiced with vanilla. Okay, now this is really cool and interesting because when we think about vanilla, it is cultivated actually in the New World, right? But it does grow wildly and was picked in ancient times and sold through the spice trades that would run across very, very distant regions, so maybe even reaching from India to Jerusalem. And this is teaching us about trade routes, and it's teaching us about exotic items. It's teaching us about what the elites in Jerusalem were trying to do in order to show that they were elites. And so this is some of the cool research that we have going on, and that's just one.
It's amazing. Well, and I know that speaking of the trade routes, and I'm trying to remember what the actual artifact is, of course you'll know, there's an artifact in the Pilgrimage Road area that they believe came from Pompeii, or ties to Pompeii, right?
Yes. So there's a lot of these artifacts from the Pilgrimage Road because, and this is interesting because in the Second Temple period in Jerusalem, Jewish religious belief and practice is becoming much, much, much more, I'd say, tight, strict. There were a lot of different ways of interpreting it, but people were very, very, very devout to the religion. They were very, very busy fighting with each other because each one was saying, I'm interpreting things right, and then you say you're interpreting it, and I'm a fool and I don't know what I'm doing. So we were fighting all the time, but they were trying to keep Jewish religious law, or what we call halakha. So in one sense, we see a lot less being imported into Jerusalem at that time, and still you have luxury goods arriving, particularly, exotic items made of raw materials that couldn't be found in Jerusalem, but also artisan items that would be imported. And so there's a lot going on in that.
So I want to ask a clarification question, and I know that you could speak 5 hours on just this question, so just, a summary as you can. We keep talking about the artifacts that we have on display are 2,000 years old. They're from the Second Temple period. You keep talking about the Second Temple period, but you also mentioned you have items from the First Temple period. Can you just explain for those of us who don't remember our history lessons, what does that mean? What is the time frame? What's the difference between First and Second Temple?
Sure. So, okay, this is going to be I'm going to try to do it short. Okay, so basically, roughly 3,000 years ago, a figure that we know of from the Hebrew Bible by the name of David rises to power and basically establishes the kingdom of Israel. Now, if you want to get really into detail, yes, before David there was Saul, but the king that established the dynasty that would continue was David. David begins, there are a lot of arguments amongst archaeologists as to how large his kingdom was, how large or small it was, but at the end of the day, he is the one who establishes the dynasty and the kingdom of Israel begins, so roughly 1000 BC. That kingdom then splits into two separate kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, or what we can call the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. That happens, let's say, roughly around 900 BC. If you want to get technical, 924 BC. Okay? At that time, both kingdoms begin to flourish and grow. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire destroys the kingdom of Israel. The kingdom of Judah withstands and continues to flourish until 586 BC. In 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire destroys the kingdom of Judah, destroys Jerusalem, and destroys the first the first temple, I should say, because we're not talking about Jewish, we're talking about Judah, and it's a little bit of a technical difference. 70 years later, Jerusalemites return to Jerusalem. This is called the Return to Zion, and begin to rebuild it, first with a very small, modest temple, which is then expanded and expanded and expanded until it reaches its peak roughly around the 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, beginning with a very, very, very powerful king by the name of Herod. Okay, and Herod was a very, very smart king because he realized that in order to succeed, he had to really, really give the Roman Empire a big bear hug and really go with them. And he is known as the Great Builder, but it's obvious that he just put into motion a lot of the building projects that we see in Jerusalem, and they continued after his death and continued all the way up until 70 CE. In 70 CE, the Romans conquer and destroy Jerusalem after 4 years of rebellion. This rebellion begins in 66 and continues until 70 when Jerusalem is destroyed, and lingers on in sites, particularly Masada, which we also have here in the exhibit, which falls in 73 CE. Our historical textbook, and we have to remember historical textbooks are subjective, but our historical textbook for this period is the works of Josephus Flavius. And Josephus tells us the story, which is a very well-known story of the choice that the Jews at Masada make of whether they want to fall captive to the Romans or whether they want to commit suicide. And they take lots, and they end up choosing a group that basically kills the rest of them and then kills themselves, and then the Romans conquer the site with no one left. some speculation and doubt has been called into this whole story, whether it actually happened or whether this is Josephus's way of, spicing up the story. So it depends on which scholar you ask. I am still I'm trying to think of the right word. I still go with that theory.
With the suicide theory.
Yes, but others don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I took my history lesson. I appreciate it. So I have 9,000 questions, but let's obviously talk about the scrolls. This morning, as we were doing the scroll swap, we had some media here, and I was listening to you talk to the media, and I think you told someone there are 25,000 fragments of the scrolls that have been found, or scrolls themselves that have been found. Can you elaborate?
Yes. So the IAA, the Israel Antiquities Authority, as you asked before, is in charge not only of conducting the excavations, but for caring of the objects, of the artifacts, doing some of the research, because sometimes it's us, sometimes it's other scholars from universities and stuff, but the conservation. Now, a scroll is in some senses like a piece of paper, although it's very different, where if you leave a piece of paper outside for a really long time, it will disappear, right? Well, the scrolls were found in a very, very, very dry environment, the Judean desert. That dry environment helped preserve them over those thousands of years. However, they were, for the most part, not preserved in a very, very complete manner. So they broke apart. And that is the 25,000 fragments in our collection, because basically these scrolls came apart. So sometimes we have fragments or scrolls that are very, very large, and sometimes they can be as small as my fingernail. And part of our work is to make sure that they continue to be preserved for hundreds and thousands of years forward. Now, we have 25,000 fragments, but we group them into manuscripts. And this begins with the early scholars who in the late 40s and 1950s were receiving the fragments at the Rockefeller Museum and trying to put together the puzzle. Because imagine yourselves with a 1,000-piece puzzle, and putting it together.
Without the box.
Now here, it's not just without the box. You're getting, out of the 1,000 pieces, you're only getting about 200 pieces. Now put it together. Now let's take it one step further. Now take 1,000-piece puzzles. Take 200 pieces from here, 150 pieces from here, 300 pieces from here. From every box puzzle, take a bunch, mix them all together, throw them on the ground, and now get to work. Okay? And that's what these initial scholars had to do. They were working piece by piece, and we have amazing quotes about they would work for 3 hours and say, we had to stop for today because our heads were exploding already. Or, each scholar got a group of fragments, a group of these puzzle pieces to work with, and then they would turn around and all of a sudden a different scholar would say, I think he's got some of ours. Go over and grab from him. And he'd have to fight to keep his puzzle pieces. But at the end of the day, they did a wonderful job of putting these fragments together into roughly 1,200 manuscripts. 930 of those manuscripts come from Qumran. So Qumran, or the caves around Qumran, is the main focal point of the site. Now, the one thing that these scholars had no idea about was conservation. So they were doing all kinds of things that were actually causing further damage to the scrolls. For example, they were working with bare hands. They were exposing them to outside light because they had big windows open and the light was shining in. And if you go into the exhibit, you'll notice all the lights are really dim.
Well, and you'll also notice my favorite picture where they're smoking over these fragments.
And that's also one of the things that everyone loves, is seeing the early scholars leaning over the scrolls as they're working on them, smoking with the cigarettes. But there's actually something or two things that they were doing which caused much more damage. One of them is, say you've got a $10 bill in your pocket, and you don't realize, and you put other things in your pocket, and when you come to pay at the store, and I know today everyone pays with their cell phones, but I still remember the day where we paid with dollar bills. So you take out the bill, and all of a sudden it's all ripped. And you come to pay, well, the guy at the counter is not going to take your $10 bill like that. So what do? You tape it together. That's what they were doing. If they found joints of fragments, they were using Scotch tape to tape them together. And that Scotch tape is sinking into the fragments and causing them damage. We have original, it's not as exciting as seeing the scrolls, but if you go up into the science gallery, after that picture you love, seeing Lancaster Harding, which you will never find him without a cigarette in his mouth. But right next to that, we have a small display case where we have a Petri dish with a bunch of pieces of the Scotch tape, which our team removed because we want to stop that damage from continuing. And so this is some of the work that we do at the IAA, is actually undoing the damage that had been done by the early scholars.
It's crazy. And I actually have another point about the preservation of the scrolls, but first I want to ask, I'm often asked, and now I can get the real answer, all of these scrolls, is the thought that they were scribes purposefully trying to retell the Bible or the Torah, or is it that they were practicing the messages? What is the reasoning we think? Because there's more than one copy of some of these scrolls, right? So what's the thought process behind how these scrolls were actually created?
So, that's a great question and a very complicated question. And
of course.
If I tell you that, here is the definite answer, then I'd be lying to all of you, because these are things that scholars debate. What we have, and this is important to stress, are copies, okay? They're copies of books, okay? If we're talking about...
The scrolls are original, but what they are creating is copies of.
Exactly. You're right. I have to be very careful, because then you all think of, I'm just looking at a copy in there. No, you're looking at the original. But the book of Isaiah was composed probably somewhere in the 7th century BCE, okay? The copy of the scroll here is from the 1st century BCE, so it's about 600 years later. That book would have been copied over by scribes over generation by generation by generation by generation, a practice that's basically conducted up until this day, except that today we have printing presses, right? And then you don't. So if you wanted a copy of the book of Isaiah, you needed to have a scribe copy it over. Now we say book, and you guys are thinking book, but actually a book is a scroll, okay? And at this point, and this is an important point, you mentioned the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, we are not talking about the book of the Bible. Each book is its own separate entity. So we have the Isaiah scroll, and we have the Psalm scroll.
Yes.
The only books where we see that there's more than one book are the 5 books of the Torah. So we sometimes have Genesis, Exodus together, or Leviticus, Numbers, and we actually have one of those here. I think being installed tomorrow morning. I don't want to give too much away. So each book is its own entity, and we're also talking about a period where the final version, as we know it, of the Hebrew Bible had not been sealed. And this is an important point, because when we look at a Hebrew Bible today, okay, we can buy it in Jerusalem, we can buy it in Simi Valley, it will be exactly the same text. This is something that's called the sealing of the Masoretic text, okay, where it no longer undergoes any changes and there are no variants. But actually, in the Second Temple period, we can have, and you mentioned, you have numerous copies of the same book. So those copies don't necessarily match 100% the Masoretic text, and they also don't necessarily match each other 100%. And what that's telling us is that there were different versions of the same book. Now you say different versions of the same book. How much of a difference? Well, the differences can be really, really minor, but sometimes they're more extensive and can be significant. For example, the book of Psalms, which is the most popular, I say popular, but the most common book that we found, and I do believe that it's a popularity issue. We have, I believe, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly, 39 copies of Psalms. So when we put it together, we end up with 157 Psalms. Now, if you open up your copies of the Hebrew Bible, you will have 150. Okay? We've got an additional 7 Psalms from the scrolls at Qumran, which were not part of the copy that was chosen to be in the Masoretic text.
And again, I've yet to get to any of these questions. And a fact I know that I think people would be interested to know is through the science that you guys are doing, you're now able to start connecting which scribes have written which scrolls.
So this is an amazing project that's taken on by a team from Holland, from Reagan University, where they took our database of images, and I'll speak about the database of images in a moment, because that's really important, because every good science project begins with good data, okay? And so their data is our images, and we'll talk about the images momentarily, but basically what they're doing is they're trying to develop algorithms and plugging in the images into machine learning and artificial intelligence, and in order to identify the different scribes that wrote the scrolls. Now, here's the thing. If we are professional scribes living in the same period, then we will both learn to write an A the same way, a B the same way, and a C the same way. And so if we just look at it, they may seem very similar. Another thing is, if I write down my name today and I write it tomorrow, it may not look exactly the same, because today I'm fully energetic, but tomorrow I am tired and I didn't get a good night's sleep, so there might be slight changes. One of the things that doesn't change are the mechanics, okay? And that's what the AI is trying to identify, to how I hold the pen, my strength, okay, which doesn't change drastically. And they do this by identifying the strokes, the different strokes of the letters. So they're not taking an A and comparing it to the A, they're comparing the strokes of the different letters. And this is a project that's ongoing, but they've already made major contributions to understanding who wrote the scrolls. Can I go back to the images?
Go ahead.
Or you have other?
We're good.
Okay. So the images. So here's the really cool thing. I mentioned before that the original scholars were doing a bunch of things that were causing damage. Okay, so we don't smoke over the scrolls anymore. No smoking is allowed indoors. Okay, so we've stopped that. But one of the questions that came up is, how do we know that in 20 years or 30 years, professionals aren't going to come and say, Joe, that idiot, he was doing so much damage to the scrolls, okay? Well, first of all, Joe's not touching the scrolls, okay? So let's put it that way. But the conservators. So basically, the IA began a process of trying to come up with a way of monitoring the state of conservation of the scrolls by creating objective parameters and then being able to compare them over time. And after consultations, the tool that was chosen was something we call multispectral imaging. And you can see actually up in our science gallery a reconstruction of what that is. But basically, we're taking the light in the room and we're creating it in a very controlled environment where we can completely control it, so we won't use white walls because they'll reflect the light and change things up. And then we take that light and we slice it up into different wavelengths and different angles, and basically create the best documentation of the scrolls, which can then be compared over time. So I can take a picture of the scroll now, I can take a picture of the scroll in a year, and compare the two and see the slightest changes of colors or the slightest changes in the waviness. Now, this has also helped the reading of the text, because as you will notice in the exhibition, you'll sometimes be looking at the scroll and it'll be quite difficult to read. That's why we've given you two pictures. One on the left side is the color image, which looks basically the same as the scroll itself. On the other side of it is what we call the infrared image. And the infrared image basically reacts to the carbon-based ink and makes the reading much, much easier. And now let's tie this all in with California, because the company that was chosen to build the system and that we've been working with for the past 15 years is Megavision Ltd., which is right here, half an hour away. So
Love it.
That's the connection between California and the Dead Sea Scrolls.
I love it.
They weren't written here, but they were documented here. Yeah.
So we've been talking about the preservation of the scrolls. And so part of that preservation is that when they are on display, they can't be in the light for more than 3 months every 5 years. So my question to you all is, who here has actually been to our exhibit in the past 3 months and seen our scrolls? Okay, wow, that's impressive. Okay, so I encourage all of you to come back again starting Saturday, because starting Saturday, the 8 scrolls you saw are gone, and we have an 8 entire new set of scrolls. Again, that's why Joe is here, is with his team. This week, they have been slowly removing them. Actually, 4 came out yesterday. I think 2 more came out today. But by Saturday, it will be a completely new set of scrolls. And so he mentioned the Great Psalm scroll. That was really the main focus scroll that we've had on display for the past 3 months. And now I think the main focus scroll is the Isaiah scroll. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. But can I just say, for me, it's like when, if someone asks you, who's your favorite child? So it's really difficult to pick, right?
And I know you love the Psalm scroll.
I love the Psalm scroll. But we've installed in this round one of the scrolls of the book of Isaiah. The book of Isaiah is a very, very, very prominent book in the Dead Sea Scrolls Library, or in the Qumran Library. It has 21 copies that were found. One of the copies is on display in Israel at the Shrine of the Book. And there, that copy is actually very, very special, because it is the only book that we have in its complete form, from beginning to end. The fragment we have here actually brings a portion of Isaiah, which is basically the prophet who is rebuking the city of Tyre for being a city that strives for riches, and telling them that God doesn't like or doesn't honor people who all they're interested in is striving for riches, but rather people who are more humble and who keep the law, and so on and so forth. And so this is a section of the rebuke of Tyre. Now, the book of Isaiah in general is, again, a very, very important book in the Qumran community. It's also a very, very important book within early Christianity, because of its messages of first of all, its messianic prophecies, but also because there are other messages in the book, such as keeping, a modest lifestyle, and and so on and so forth. And so these are things that connect really between Isaiah, the Qumran community, and early Christianity.
So thank you. So again, these scrolls will all be in on Saturday, and these scrolls will only be here for 3 months. And then in June, we'll switch them out again. So just a reason to keep on coming back. Now, although I have a zillion questions, I want to leave some time for the audience. So I think the last question I will leave you with before we open it to the audience is, what are you hoping that visitors take away from the exhibition in terms of historical and cultural appreciation, and what's the importance of the exhibition traveling?
So first of all, I will say I want everyone to walk out with their own, personal, this is what I took away. I don't want to put, necessarily ideas into anyone's head. I do want them to walk away with, first of all, how rich the culture in Israel was 2,000 years ago, how connected that culture is to modern day cultures. So this is not something that's completely separated and foreign to us. I always like to tell the story of when I first took the position as the head of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I brought my two youngest children, who were 8 at the time, to the lab, and my predecessor, Penina Shore, brought out one of the scrolls, actually the Psalm scroll, and said to them, okay, what do you see? And it took them about 30 seconds, but after about 30 seconds, they began reading the scroll, which was written 2,000 years ago, because it's the same Hebrew script that they learn in school. And it's the same texts. Maybe here slight changes, there are slight changes, but it's the same text. It's the book of Psalms. They know the text. And so I think this is something that's really important, just to understand there are very, very strong connections between what's going on in the land 2,000 years ago and modern cultures today. Judaism, Christianity, a little bit later, Islam, and that's also part of the exhibition, because when you walk in, the first thing you meet are 3 artifacts representing the 3 monotheistic religions which flourished in the land and is seen in its archaeological remains.
Thank you for that. We're going to turn to you all. If you don't have questions, I have a ton more, so don't worry about it. Please wait for someone from our audience to bring a microphone to you, because we are recording this. So, Tricia, there's a hand back there. Oh, Mason has a, great, go ahead.
Hello, I would like to know, is there any evidence or anything possibly written with these, or why did they store them and preserve them and then put them into the caves? What was the purpose? Or, I mean, obviously for future use, but was it because they thought maybe they would be attacked, and such as the temple was burned down twice and such?
So that's an excellent question. This is one of the biggest scholarly debates going on around the Qumran Library and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think there's a text panel in the exhibition which breaks down some of the theories. For example, you mentioned, was it being put there because they were afraid of attack? One of the theories is that the caves surrounding Qumran have nothing to do with the site of Qumran itself, but rather are scrolls that were taken by refugees fleeing from Jerusalem and hidden in the caves. I'm not a believer in that theory, but it is an existing scholarly theory. I think that those caves are basically what you can look at as the archive or library, and I don't use those words lightly in this building, but the archive or library of the group of people living at Qumran who kept them there in order to store them and maybe once in a while even take it out and use it and read it. And so that's what I believe they are. I believe there is a strong connection between the caves and the site, but there are debates about this and why they were found and how they were stored. We always like to tell the story of the way they were first discovered, which was that in the winter of 1946, 1947, 2 Bedouin shepherds were walking with their herd when one goat escaped into a crack in the rock. They picked up the stones, They began throwing them in, and they heard one of the jars break, and then they went in and discovered the first 7 scrolls. Those are the only scrolls that were actually found in jars, okay? The rest of the scrolls were found outside of jars. So were they all being kept in jars and the jars broke? Were they being held on shelves which collapsed? These are questions which are still being developed and debated.
Hi. Can you comment on the Tetragrammaton in the Paleo-Hebrew? Why did that change so much from the Yud-He-Vav-He?
Oh,
and number 2,
Yeah.
on Psalm, I think it's 145, why is the Nun in the Dead Sea Scrolls, whereas it's not in our prayer book?
So wait, I'll answer the first question, then I'll get to the second question, which I may have to ask you to go to repeat. So regarding the Tetragrammaton, or the name of God, Yud-He-Vav-He, which is written in the scrolls, quite often what it will be written in is Paleo-Hebrew. So let's just break this down a little bit for those who don't know. There's the language of Hebrew, but there are different scripts. There is the Paleo-Hebrew, or the ancient Hebrew, which is common in the First Temple period. And then there's the Aramaic, or square Hebrew script, which was adopted in the Second Temple period and is in use until this day. And so I mentioned my children who came to the lab, and the one word that they couldn't read on the Psalm scroll was the Tetragrammaton, or the name of God, because it's written in Paleo-Hebrew. The form of the letters is different. However, even though they had adopted the square Hebrew script, they still knew how to write in Paleo-Hebrew in the Second Temple period. They just used it for very specific cases. For example, the name of God in many scrolls. Why did they use it? There are 2 main possibilities that we can discuss. One is to prevent it from being read off by accident and pronounced, because you're not supposed to pronounce the name of God. The second is perhaps they perceived of the Paleo-Hebrew as a holier script. And that goes to the second instance where we see the Paleo-Hebrew used extensively, is that if we're talking about the book of Psalms or the book of Isaiah or a sectarian scroll, they won't be written in Paleo-Hebrew completely. But we do have scrolls that are completely written in Paleo-Hebrew, and some of them will be on display in round 2 here. And those are specific to the 5 books of the Torah, where they use Paleo-Hebrew sometimes, not all the time, to write the entire scroll. In terms of your second question of differences between the scroll as you see it, the Psalm scroll, which you saw here, and Psalms as you know it, this is exactly going back to that point that I had made about differences in different versions of the book of Psalms prior to the sealing of the Masoretic text. And so the leather sheet that you saw here, which is part of the Great Psalm Scroll, the Great Psalm Scroll has several differences. I mentioned the 7 Psalms that weren't included. The order of the Psalms is different. And there are also other differences in terms of words that are changed, that may be missing, or that are added. And so I hope that answered the questions.
Are there any questions on this side? No? Okay, we can go back.
Oh, okay. Hello. What instrument was used to write the scroll? I mean, what was it written with? I mean, what is it? What's the material?
What we believe was used was a stylus, which would be a very, very, very thin, pointed, probably made from bone, worked tool. You'd have an inkwell, and a couple of those are on display here, and then you'd take the stylus and you'd dip it into the ink, and then you'd write. And there's actually a display of both an inkwell and a stylus next to a reconstructed scroll in the Ten Commandments gallery. So that's the tool that would probably be used to write the scrolls.
Okay, Mason up here.
I was just wondering about the different languages that the scrolls were written in. When did they phase out Paleo-Hebrew? And is the square Hebrew, is that Aramaic? And then I saw there was some that were written in Greek as well. So I was just curious about all the timing and how you figure out. I know that's not like before the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, like what the writing was.
So, okay, so I want to separate that question into two. There's language and there's script, and they're two different things. So you mentioned Greek. We do have Greek scrolls. We have a little bit of scrolls in Latin. For example, I'm going off on a tangent, so if I forget your question, you'll remind me. One of the cool things we have is a payslip found at Masada belonging to a Roman soldier from Beirut who was serving in the 10th Legion. And he either dropped his payslip, or one might say he threw it on the ground in anger, because that month he received 50 dinar. But then he was deducted for his boots and for his equipment and for his shoes and for the barley that he received, and he ended up with how much? 0. Okay? So that's just a side point. So we have Greek, we have Latin, we have some later documents written in Arabic, we have Aramaic, and we have Nabatean. The large part of our collection is written in Hebrew. I would say roughly 2/3 is written in Hebrew. Now, if I take that Hebrew, I can break it down into different types of scripts, primarily the Paleo-Hebrew, which I mentioned before, and the square Hebrew, which is the same script used for Aramaic. So even though these are two different languages, Aramaic and Hebrew, they're both being written with the same script. When does Paleo-Hebrew phase out and square Hebrew come in? Somewhere in the early Second Temple period, so what we would call the Persian period, roughly 2,400 or 2,300 years ago. The way we know this is because the documents we have dating to the First Temple period will all be written in Paleo-Hebrew, and then we begin to see roughly around the turn of the Persian period and into the Hellenistic period, the use of Aramaic and the square Hebrew script for writing Hebrew. So I hope that answered that question.
Yes, thank you. The imponderable question that I always have is, does anybody know why the scrolls waited until after the formation of Israel to reveal themselves?
Well, to be perfectly honest, they didn't. Although it's a nice thought, they were actually first discovered. The first scrolls were discovered in the winter of 46-47, and the state of Israel began in 1948. However, there is an interesting connection, because although they were found in 1946-47, the first scrolls were purchased by Professor Eliezer Sukenik on the 29th of November, 1947. That's the same day where the UN resolution of beginning or recognizing the need for the state of Israel was declared. And so there is a very, very close connection here between the two. And just as a side note, I mentioned all these. One of the things I like to say, I hit the microphone. That's a bad. One of the things that I like is looking back at these quotes and that we have of these original scholars working. I mentioned Eliezer Sukenik. He was professor at the Hebrew University in Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. In order to purchase the scrolls, he had to get on a bus and go to Bethlehem. He describes that he was in fear of his life, basically, and yet at the same time could not pass up on the chance of obtaining these scrolls. And so all these sort of great, crazy messages that we have from these early scholars. Or we have a letter here, not part of the IAA artifacts, but written between Trevor, who photographed the scrolls for the first time and sent them to William Foxwell Albright, the outstanding American scholar, who then announced, "You have made the greatest discovery ever." And so just connecting to these, these emotional, statements is just amazing.
I think we have time for one last question. We can go over here.
Two questions. The fragments in Greek, etc., are they found, any of them, in Qumran? That's number one. Number two, there must be significant risk in transporting these priceless items. Could you discuss the risks and then what's going on to protect them and so forth?
Okay, so I'll start with the Greek. Yes, it's an easy question. Yes, we have some documents in Greek from Qumran. There are few. We have many more documents in Greek in the later periods. For example, we have groups of documents from the period of the Second Jewish Revolt, or the Bar Kokhba Revolt, from the 2nd century CE. Many of those are written in Greek because Greek is sort of the English of that time. But there are from Qumran. In terms of the risks, yes. We take the greatest care in order to transport these items in a way that they won't be damaged. And as Melissa mentioned before, we only put them on display for 3 months to minimize their exposure to light. In addition to that exposure, we also have to prepare what we call a capsule. Okay? And basically that capsule is built up of different layers of materials which are approved in terms of the conservation, so that they're not letting out even any gases or anything that can cause damage to the scrolls. And we prepare that capsule where the scroll, can I?
Yeah, of course.
We prepare the capsule where the scroll is basically sewn in between 2 layers of a netting, okay, known as stable text, and that netting is pulled in between different layers and floating between spacers, so it's floating in the air but being held in place in between these layers of netting. And therefore no pressure is coming on the scroll, but the scroll can't move either. Preparing each one of these scrolls for exhibition takes, if I'm being, a minimalist on the minimal side, it takes days upon days. So then you say, okay, so why is it worth it to put all this trouble into it? Shouldn't you just keep them in your storeroom and, let them sit there and be safe? There are debates about this in the scholarly community. In my eyes, I think it's important to give everyone the opportunity to come sort of face-to-face with these artifacts, with the originals, with the authentic artifacts. I think that hits home much more, and therefore we're not just hiding away our knowledge, but we're sharing it with all of you. So that's my answer to that.
And I was in my head, what's the last question I want to ask you? But that was actually a really great way to end it. So I want to thank you for coming. I know you are a busy, busy man. You have a lot more work to do. So probably as soon as we're done here, you're going to keep working. So thank you. Thanks to all of you for coming. And we really appreciate your time. Thank you. I'll take you off the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as our special guest and party exits the building.